Hi folks, so in this video we're going to be talking about focusing, and it may seem like a silly thing to cover in a video, but when we're dealing with digital cameras there are some things you need to consider and be mindful of when you're focusing your camera. And that's just because there's a number of different ways that you can focus with digital cameras. You can use autofocus or manual focus, and then within that there's a couple different things that you just need to be aware of. So I'll take you through in this video manual focus and autofocus, but I'm going to start with autofocus because I just think that with the cameras these days the autofocus works really well, and unless you totally don't trust your camera or you just for some reason have a preference for manual focus, I believe you'll be focusing most of your images with the autofocus function. Okay, and so we're here now on the back of my camera, and one thing that you have to be aware of with digital cameras is that in order to engage your focus, you're going to have to engage your shutter. Okay, so as we talked about in the last video, your shutter is going to be found on the top of your camera. In my case, it's here. And to engage the autofocus, sorry, my camera keeps turning off because I'm not using it. And to engage the autofocus, you need to press your shutter down halfway, okay? So if you look at this little green square in the middle of my composition, if I press my shutter down halfway, you'll see that the camera beeps and it engages the autofocus. And so you have to be mindful to do that every single time you're making a picture, because again, you're using autofocus and you're not using your manual focus. Most of the time you're probably going to be moving around between images, and so your focus will change. And so just to be mindful, something that I do every single time before I make a picture is I'll engage the autofocus a couple times just to make sure that I am refocusing before I make my picture. Okay. Once you have your focus set, you would then engage your shutter. So for this image, I would have my focus on these speakers here first, and then press my shutter all the way down. All right. So that's going to be pretty standard for all your cameras. You start to run into some variation from camera to camera when you start to look at how the autofocus functions. Okay, so for my camera, I have this little knob back here, and I can move my point of focus around the composition. Okay, so you can see that this little square is moving around as I move my knob. Okay, so I can, if I say I want to focus on the background, I can move my focus back there, press my shutter, and you'll see this focus shift from these speakers to the back of the room. If I wanted to move it back, I could then move it to the speakers and re-engage my autofocus and do things that way. Now, I know again that everybody's going to have a different camera, so you may not have this option of moving your point of focus around, okay? And so in that case, what you'll probably have to do is move the physical camera around when you're focusing, okay? So that might look like this. So for example, let's say I want to focus back here again. If my focus is not able to move with this knob, I would have to move the camera. So what you would do is you would kind of move your camera to where you want your point of focus to be. Okay, so let's say back there. So I'm moving my camera back there. I would then engage my autofocus by pushing my shutter halfway down, and then I can go and recompose, still holding the shutter down halfway till I'm happy with my composition, and then engage my shutter. Okay, if for example you were to not move your camera, so let's say we want to focus on the background, if you don't hold your shutter down, you'll lose the focus. Okay, so here I'm moving my point of focus back to the background, then moving it here. If I were to let go and try to press it again, before I make the image, it would refocus. So you have to make sure that you're engaging the autofocus by pressing down your shutter halfway, then recomposing, and then making the picture. Okay? So that's just something you're going to have to play around with if you don't have this option with the knob. So now I'm going to take you through the different kinds of focusing your camera might have access to. So currently we are on this point focus, this single point focus, okay? So if I go into my menu here, so I'm pressing my menu button, and I go into the autofocus or the focusing menu, you'll see here that I have different options. And so AF typically stands for autofocus. So if I go to autofocus mode and I open up these different modes of focusing, you'll see I have single point, I have zone, I have a wide tracking, and then I have one that engages all. Okay, so these, again, they might be different on your camera, but they'll function very similar. And again, I probably should have said this at the beginning of the video, but please have your user manual available to you whenever you're watching these videos, because again, that's going to tell you everything you need to know about your cameras and the different functions and modes. Okay, so I'll just take you through these just so you can see how they change, right? So if I go down here to zone focus, and then I go back into my screen here. So this takes a wider sampling of the focusing area. Okay, I can also move this around too. Again, some of your cameras might not have this function, but if I then engage my shutter for autofocus, you'll see that it's taking different points. So it's kind of taking an average of the zone of this bigger point where it's trying to focus from. Okay, so if I move that back here, you'll see that it's taking 4 points of focus from there. Okay, so this is maybe good if you have a bigger area and you're not sure like exactly where you want the focus to fall. This will kind of sample from a bunch of different areas to give you like an average of where the focus is. Okay, I don't particularly use this one. I use the single point focus just because I have this nice little knob I can move around, okay? But maybe this will be useful to you with your pictures, depending on what you're photographing. I'm going to go back into the autofocus modes, and I'm going to take you to the wide and tracking mode. And I kind of believe that this is for, you know, if you're shooting fast sports or something like that, where you're making multiple images at a time, it'll kind of track as your subject matter is moving. I have a feeling for our class you're not probably going to be using this, although you might want to play around with it if you have it on your camera. But this, you know, it's kind of taking, again, a larger sample area, and it's not as controllable, right? Like again, it's going to be tracking if a moving subject or something along those lines. So it's going to be using like smart technology. But you can see here that when I move my knob here, that little box that I autofocus with is gone. So you're kind of using the technology of the camera to get your focus. Okay, so I think it's a little less control, but it's a particular function for when you're doing particular kinds of photography. And then if you go down here to all, again, you have your box, right? But it's kind of, I think this is incorporating all of the different ways of focusing with this particular camera. I don't ever use this really. All I'm really using when I'm photographing with my camera is I do the single point focus, because I feel like it gives you the most control when you're focusing with your camera. Okay, so that's going to be the autofocus. And then I'll take you through manual focus, just to give you an idea of what you can do with it and what you might be looking for when you're using it. So as I mentioned before, shifting between autofocus and manual focus, it might vary where that switches on your camera. For me, you can't see it here, but there's a little knob in the front of my camera, and what mode I'm in is indicated on my LED screen here. So you can see this AFS. So that stands for autofocus single. Okay, so if I switch it here, it switches to AFC, which is autofocus continuous, meaning that if I were to be doing photographing where I was holding down the shutter and having like a bunch of images made in succession, this would kind of track that point of focus. I'm not going to show you that one because, again, I think that's a specialized way of focusing. But here, this last mode is manual focus, so MF, that's manual focus. And I know I'm in manual focus because I now have this indicator here of distance, okay? So these numbers here, they're actually in meters, but this is telling me where the point of focus is currently, okay? So right now, 1 being 1 meter, 5 being 5 meters, 10 meters, and so on and so forth. That's where my point of focus is falling. And so now, if I were to engage my focusing ring, which is, you can't see, but it's on the front of my camera, if I were to twist it, you can see that that little dash underneath the distance is moving, and that's telling me that I'm moving my point of focus further away. It may be hard to see in these small LED screens where the point of focus is, but you can see maybe that it's falling off of focus from the speakers and now in the background, and if I twist my focus ring the other way, now we're coming back to focus in the foreground. Okay. And like I said, manual focus is a good tool, but at the same time, like I said, it's hard on these LED screens to really see what you're focusing on. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And so sometimes, again, depending on your camera, you're going to have assistance in focusing with your manual function. So if I go here, I'm back in my menu. I'm going to go down. And I have this thing called Manual Focus Assist, and right now it's on standard. So that means when I'm looking through my LED screen, all you're seeing is the point of focus shift. But you do have these ways to help you kind of see what you're focusing and where. And so this one is called Digital Split Image. So I have it on color here. If I go back into my camera, now you see that there's this square in the middle. Okay, and what that square does, it allows you to kind of see where the focus is falling with different colors. Okay, so as I'm moving back in focus, a little difficult to see, but there's some color shifts that are happening. I've never really used this one because, again, I don't really use autofocus that often. If I go back in here, I found this one to be kind of helpful in the past. But again, I don't use it too often, but this is focal peak highlight, so that means where the point of focus is falling. That's the focal peak, that's the term they're using. And so you see here now, I have this red shift happening where the focus is. Okay, so right now the focus is falling on these front of these speakers and then a little bit on the table. As I move the focusing ring, you'll see that it shifts, so now it's coming a little forward. And if I were to twist it the other way, you'll see that it'll go back into space. So now it's kind of like harder to see because there's more things back there. But you'll see that red now is on that back wall, on that painting. You can see it kind of change as I change the focusing ring. Okay. So like I said, I don't use this that often. I really do rely on my autofocus when I'm making my pictures, but know that this is an option as well. Okay. So yeah, that's going to be your focusing with your digital cameras, and I'll see you in the next video.